Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our virtual Wednesday night Bible study. We've been saying it for a couple of weeks now. This is not our preferred format for Bible study. We would much rather be together. We would rather be in the meeting house, all of us shaking hands and putting our arms around each other's necks and giving each other hugs. We would much rather be in that position. But we are where we are. And so we have found the video format posted to our social media pages, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. They have been very effective, and people are able to access the online virtual Bible study via their phone or a computer, so it's helpful. And we're grateful that we're all together now to study together. This has been a crazy couple of weeks, has it not? We've been dealing with the shut-in because of the coronavirus, and now people are starting to really feel the economic impact of not working, of being at home. In addition to that, this week, as this video airs, we've had a catastrophic week in Chattanooga with some terrible storms ripping through East Brainerd, Ooltewah, Collegedale area. And so our heart and our prayers go out to the folks that have suffered damage or have even been physically injured because of that. In fact, we probably all know people by name who have either lost something on their property or their property itself. So we're just so sorry that's happened. And we don't say this just to be frivolous and meaningless, but we really do say it because it is our absolute honest intent that if you need help of any kind, be sure to call us, contact us somehow, the North Hamilton Church of Christ. We are here to help. We want to help in whatever way we can. We want to be of assistance to you, most of all spiritually, but physically, financially. If there's something that we can do, you call us, and if we're capable of doing it, we want to be there for you because we believe that's what God would have the church to be. We have, for the last several weeks, been studying the nature of God, and we have been exploring the vastness of God, His enormity, His immensity, and we've been doing that with the understanding that to explore the nature of God unlocks all of the de-stressing, the promises of peace and hope in the Scripture. And I think we're starting to see that because the more we understand God and His greatness, it certainly makes our present travails seem small compared to God. And we're hoping that's what's taking place as we study the nature of God. So tonight, let's study a little bit more about the nature of God, and we're going to flow from last week's lesson. Now, here's what we covered last week. Last week, if you'll go back and view the video, we talked about the omnipotence of God. Now, that means that God is all-powerful. Okay, so this week we want to add to our understanding of the omnipotence of God by talking about the sovereignty of God. The sovereignty of God. So, if God is all-powerful, if God is unlimited in His ability, then that unlimited ability, that unlimited power implies control. That God is in charge. He has authority. See, sovereignty is the consequence of God's omnipotence. I like the way that one man said it. I'm going to quote from him. He said, "We cannot suppose God a creator without supposing sovereign domain or dominion to Him." Right? So he's expressing essentially what we just said is that if God has all power, if He's omnipotent, then by virtue of Him being omnipotent, He is also sovereign, right? If He has all power, then He naturally, as a consequence of that, has all control. I think if we ever lose sight of the fact that God is omnipotent, then we lose a grip on the sovereignty of God. And that's when really we start feeling panicky and out of control, like the situation is never going to be resolved, and whatever we find ourselves in, like currently the coronavirus and the threat of economic collapse and now tornadoes ripping through certain parts of our area. And it's easy to feel like the world is falling apart if we forget that God is omnipotent, because forgetting that God is omnipotent severs and separates ourselves from the sovereignty of God. And so we start thinking there is no control. There is nothing happening that is capable of being restrained. But it's just the opposite of that. I love books. I love if the book has certain qualities to it, to me it always stands out more than other books do, especially where the writer says something better than I can say it. So I always try to write it down, and I think several men have written on God's power and His sovereignty to such a degree that they've said it maybe and even illustrated it better than maybe I could say it. And there was a book, I've had it for a number of years, and the author of the book, the premise of the book is that in our culture, in this day, we are losing a grip, losing our understanding of the omnipotence of God. We are detaching ourselves, distancing ourselves from God's august nature, that He is all-powerful. And somehow, in our mind, we have reduced God into a human conception. We think of God but on our terms. And so all of a sudden now we don't see God as in charge and in control anymore. And so he says this, he says, "It is ludicrous to suppose that any sensible God can wish adult men and women to crawl about in spiritual rompers in order to preserve a rather sentimental father-child relationship. Indeed, experience shows that it is only the mature Christian man who can make or begin to see a little of the size of his father. He may have previously thought that the comparison of the relationship between the toddler and his grown-up father with his own relationship toward God was a rather exaggeration of the gulf, in intelligence at least, but in his growing maturity, he is likely to see that Christ, in His kindness of heart, has certainly not exaggerated the awe-inspiring disparity between man and God. To have a God, then, who is as much or more our superior than we are the superior of an infant child crawling on the hearthrug is not to hold a childish concept of God, but rather the reverse. It is only when we limit the mind's stirrings after its maker by imposing upon it the half-forgotten images of our own earthly parents that we grow frustrated in spirit and wonder why for us the springs of worship and love do not flow. We must leave behind parental hangover if we are able and we are to find a big enough God." Now what he's saying there is that when we start seeing God as not so big anymore, right? Our God is capable of anything. If we don't start seeing Him in those terms, then all of a sudden the impact of the omnipotence of God in everyday life, the practical application of that, like in the sovereignty of God, we sort of lose touch with the fact that God is over us, that He's Lord over us, He's King of kings and the God of gods. We can't see that if we start minimizing the august nature of God. Another writer said this, "The concept of deity which prevails most widely today, even among those who profess to give heed to the Scriptures, is a miserable caricature, a pathetic travesty of the truth. The God of the 20th century is a helpless, effeminate being who commands the respect of no really thoughtful man. The God of the popular mind is the creation of a mundane sentimentality. The God of many a present-day pulpit is an object of pity rather than awe-inspiring reverence." And I know he wrote that, not necessarily in our current time, but what he said of his own generation is certainly true of ours, that the way that we present God and the way that we talk about God and the way that we perceive God is very small compared to the reality of God, which is immense and transcendent and vast. So when we're talking about the sovereignty of God, we're talking about God's rule, His authority over everything. We're talking about His control. There's no limits to His power, and thus there are no limits to His control. God is in charge of everything. So when we're talking about sovereignty, we mean God's kingship. We mean His absolute right over all things. There's an interesting statement by Jesus in Matthew chapter 28, verse 18, when He says, "All authority is given to me in heaven and on earth." And I know if you're using King James, it's going to say the word power, but it's the word authority there. The word that gives us the sense of His own sovereignty. God is over all. Now, we have some great Bible examples of that, some wonderful Bible examples to illustrate the sovereignty of God. One of those is in the book of Exodus. Do you remember the display of God's power in Egypt? Do you remember that? 10 plagues. Beginning with water to blood, ending with the death of the firstborn, that's the 10th plague. God, in a mighty and in miraculous way, demonstrated that He is all-powerful. And by demonstrating His unlimited power, He demonstrated that He is in charge. I mean, if we were to go back and look at Exodus 5 and in Exodus chapter 6, the debate that takes place initially between Pharaoh and Moses being the mouthpiece of God, is who's in charge. Pharaoh is saying, "I'm in charge." God was telling Pharaoh, "I'm in charge, and I'm going to show you that I'm in charge." It was all a debate over the sovereignty of God, over His lordship over the earth. And God proved His sovereignty by His power, the demonstration of His power. So they come out of Egypt. And remember that the Egyptians are in hot pursuit. And remember that God miraculously divides the sea, and the Israelites walk through the sea on dry land, and the Egyptians are in hot pursuit in their chariots, and God closes up the water, and God destroys the Egyptian armies. And in chapter 15, beginning in verse 1, the people, rightfully so, they praise God for salvation. Here's the sad part, though. Down in verse 22, in the same chapter, almost in the same breath, right? Moses' pen hasn't even dried as he's writing this. "So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea." So in time, that's where they came from. They went out of the wilderness of Shur, or into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. So they're only 3 days removed from crossing the sea, where there were walls of water, and they walked through on dry land. Only 3 days from doing that. And it says, verse 23, "When they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore, the name of it was called Marah." Now, notice carefully with me, verse 24. "And the people murmured against Moses, saying, 'What shall we drink?' So he cried," in verse 25, "out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. And when he had cast it into the waters," that would be Moses did, cast the tree into the waters were made sweet. And he made a statute and an ordinance for them, and there he tested them." And notice verse 26. God says, "If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in His sight, give ear to His commandments and keep His statutes, I will put none of those diseases on you which I brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Do you know what's happening? In Exodus chapter 15, at the end of this chapter, they begin to question the sovereignty of God. Now, they may not have said it in so many words. Their question is, where's the water? I mean, we're 3 days out into the wilderness. God seriously brought us out here to kill us? That's ultimately what they're saying. They're saying now, we do not believe any longer that God has the capacity, the ability, the power to save us. And God provides. He gives them, by a powerful demonstration, the ability to turn the waters into sweet, palatable waters. And by doing that, in turn, proves that He is still in charge of them. Heed my statutes. Do what I say. That's sovereignty. That's authority. So the sovereignty of God is His ability to be in control, to rule, to be the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Here's another example. You may know this one well. 1 Samuel chapter 8. Do you remember what the plea of the people was? Give us a king so that we can be like all the nations around us. That's what they were saying. Give us a king. We want to be like everybody else. And remember what God said? He said, they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being a king over them. They have rejected my sovereignty. They are rejecting my control. And God kind of just gives them what they want, and they get to choke on that for a while until the rightful king, David, comes along. And we read about that as we go through the text. But the people were rejecting the sovereignty of God, and God explains what they don't want is me being in charge of them anymore. Here's another one, Daniel chapter 4. Now remember, the story has built up with Daniel interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream. You've got Daniel recording the events of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in chapter 3, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And by the time you get to chapter 4, there's more dreams and more interpretations taking place, and Daniel begins to explain, for example, in verse 25, by these words, God rules in the kingdom of men. And what Daniel was explaining to Nebuchadnezzar, and by implication to all of us, is that God is in charge. God can raise up kings and destroy kings, and He can raise up nations and destroy nations. God is in charge. His authority is never going to be diminished because of His power. And then I would recommend that we all read the very small one-chapter book of Obadiah. It's a great book. It's a story about the Edomites who had built these, what they believed were impregnable strongholds up on the side of a mountain. And they essentially said, who can bring us down? Nobody can do that. What they were doing was denying the sovereignty of God. They were saying, God isn't in charge of us. He's not powerful enough to bring us down. And that's exactly what God did. God brought them down to prove that He is in charge. Now, God's sovereignty is a tough thing for some people to chew on. And here's why. There are a lot of people who say, well, if God is sovereign, if He's in charge, then that must mean that He is responsible for all of the chaos that we see in the world. And so they have a real problem. They have a real struggle with the doctrine of the sovereignty of God, because somehow they believe that God orchestrates all of the bad things, the calamities that happen in the world. And I would say this, number one, God does not author our calamities. Okay, we've kind of discussed this already in a previous lesson, but God doesn't delight. He does not delight in the destruction of people. He doesn't delight. He's not overjoyed in dispensing hardship to people. Now, He can use those hardships, and He can refine character in the middle of hardships, but God's not sitting around, throwing darts at a board, and on that is just variously displayed calamities, and He says, oh, they're going to suffer a tornado this week, and there's going to be coronavirus and the economic collapse, and boy, aren't they glad I'm in charge. That God is not. His sovereignty does not mean that He's orchestrating the bad stuff in the world, and here's why. The sovereignty of God does not eliminate human choice. It does not eliminate the freedom of volition that we have. It doesn't do away with that. So, bad things happen in this world. And really every bad thing that's in this world, in one way or another, is connected to the entrance of sin into this world. Right? God created everything. It was perfect. In fact, Genesis 1:31 says it was very good. That's how God made the world. And when sin entered the world, it changed everything. Everything changed. Man's relationship to the world's relationship to man, man's relationship to other man, to human beings, it all changed because of sin. So sin entered the world, and a world of consequences entered as a result of that. So the sovereignty of God does not remove necessarily the effects of evil and wrong in the world, even though His sovereignty is capable of doing something for those who trust in Him. And we're about to explain what God can do for His people. So the sovereignty of God is His power, but that does not mean that God is manipulating and orchestrating the calamities that we face in life. As a matter of fact, it's the calamities in life that remind us of the importance of God's sovereignty, that He is in charge, right? Because I think if one thing has been made clear in all of the coronavirus mess and all the COVID-19 mess, and now with tornadoes ripping through our area, is we are not in charge. We are powerless. I am weak. I am susceptible. But God is not. God is not stumped. God is not, He is not somehow stumped with my situation. He's not helpless to do something about it. God is powerful enough. The sovereignty of God simply means that God can and God will accomplish what His will is, what His divine plan is. There are plenty of Psalms and passages in the Bible that do that. For example, Psalm 115. Psalm 115. And in Psalm 115, notice with me verse 3. Psalm 115, verse 3. He says, "But our God is in heaven. He does whatever He pleases." And since we're close to it, if we went back to the book of Job, we just flicked a few pages back and we go back to the story of Job, and we go to chapter 42 of Job. We get down to, I think, about verse 2. And in Job 42, verse 2, Job explains, "I know that you can do everything and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you." Okay, so put those two passages together, and now we have that nothing can be restrained from God. God is going to accomplish everything that He sets out to do because He is in charge. And a great example of that would be the passages that discuss the developing of the scheme of redemption in history, how God superintended Earth's history to bring about His Son. Remember the statement in Galatians 4, it's about verse 4, that God brought His Son in the fullness of times. And the fullness of times is something that God did orchestrate, the aligning of history and the working out of nations so that His Son could be in just the right place and at just the right time. God does work in the kingdom of men. In fact, He rules in the kingdom of men. He's not dishing out calamity. That's not how God works. That's not what He's doing. But because God is in control, some people think, well, that just means He's tyrannical. He's not a tyrant. That's not how our God rules at all. Our God controls in love. In Romans 8, in verse 28, the Bible tells us that God works all things out for good to those that love Him. Why is that? Because every aspect of God balances against all the other aspects of God. And if God is a God of love, if He's omnibenevolent, then His sovereignty is in harmony with His love. He controls, but He controls in compassion. He controls in love. He's gracious and merciful. Now, here are two things to take away from this aspect of God. Number one, if God is in charge, and listen to me carefully, this is for me, I need to hear this, but I know all of us need to hear this. God is able. He is able to care for His people. Okay, so I know it's easy you turn on the news feed, you open up Facebook, and it is entirely inundated. I mean, just inundated with bad news after piece of bad news after piece of bad news, and all of a sudden it seems like the world is spiraling out of control. Well, from the human perspective, there may be things that are beyond our control, but God is able to care for His people. He can do that. Might I recommend Isaiah chapter 43? About the first 12 to 13 verses are excellent at describing what God can do for His people. He gives them hope. He offers forgiveness. He sustains them. Here's the second thing. Not only is God able to care for His people, but He is fully capable of supplying their needs. So He's able to understand their situation, and then He supplies exactly what we need for that situation. Okay? So the book of Philippians chapter 4 is an excellent passage that would explain that. And I'll just read very quickly. Verse 11 beginning, Paul says, "Not that I speak in regard to need." Okay, so I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound everywhere and in all things. I've learned to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and suffer need. And then later in that chapter in verse 19, Paul finally finishes that sentiment by saying, "My God shall supply all your need according to the riches of His riches in His glory by Christ Jesus. So if you have need, God can supply the need. He is capable of caring for His people in whatever way He's going to accomplish that. Aren't you thankful for the sovereignty of God? I'm glad that in all of the mess that's taking place, that people aren't turning to me and saying, David, what's your answer for this? I don't have one. I'm not in charge. I don't have the wisdom. I don't have the knowledge. I don't have the power. I don't have the control. But the God I serve does. I am so thankful that God is in charge. Aren't you? Join us next week. We're going to add another installment. But I hope you're already getting some comfort out of our study. Please be safe. I love you guys so much. Please keep on reading, keep on studying, and please hit your knees, wear them out. Hit your knees in prayer and don't stop praying. I believe God is in charge. I believe He's capable of doing something about our situation. I think He will do something about our situation. It can't stay this way forever. Okay, I believe that. I just believe it with all of my heart because I believe that God is in charge, and I know you believe it too. I love you guys. Take care. Bye bye.